Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Advancing Distributed Energy Resources in a Community Choice Context. Thank you all for joining us. Let's see. What's going on? It's not moving. Let's see, oh, okay, I'll do it that way. So, my control isn't working as it usually does, but I will make do with that. My name is Woody Hastings, the Renewable Energy Manager for the Center for Climate Protection. My co-pilot today is Nina Turner, our Renewable Energy Program Associate. We'd like to thank our sponsor, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, for our webinar series and our work in California advancing community choice energy. Our presenters today are Lorenzo Christoph, an independent consultant for many years with the California Independent System Operator. Lorenzo will be kicking off today. And Dave Erickson with E3R Consulting, formerly of the California Public Utilities Commission and DNVGL, both deep energy experts, and their full bios are in the handout section. A little housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded. Everyone is in listen-only mode, and you can enter questions in your control panel at any time. We will save the last 15 or 20 minutes for questions and answers. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing, we will do our best to resolve the issue on the spot, but either way, we will have a recording, assuming we get a good recording. Again, speaker bios, we have a few handouts in that handout section, the speaker bios, the slide decks of each presenter today, and the report that Dave Erickson produced recently, Market Architectures for Managing Distributed Energy Resources. Just a little bit about the Center for Climate Protection's work in our Clean Power Exchange program. The Clean Power Exchange at cleanpowerexchange.org is where we house most of our community choice energy related work. We have an interactive map of all the development of community choice around the state of California. We have a bi-weekly e-news that goes out with news and stories about community choice energy. And then a whole raft of other resources related to community choice energy, including a programs page that includes some of the distributed energy resource type of programs that community choice agencies are offering. Just a note that we have our Business of Local Energy Symposium coming up on June 5th in Sacramento this year. Hope many of you can join us for that. We also produce white papers occasionally. Those are also can be found in the reports section of cleanpowerexchange.org. And then we do these webinars on a monthly basis. We're always open to suggestions for future topics, by the way. Just a little bit about the Center for Climate Protection's activity in the DER space. We basically do on a regular basis advocate community choice aggregation agencies that embrace DER as sort of a core part of their work, and we see DER as being a key means of reducing greenhouse gases, which is our Center for Climate Protection's core mission. And then there are the co-benefits that we'll hear about from our presenters, benefiting the local economy, creating opportunities for disadvantaged communities, jobs, things like that. And also we see DER as offering community choice agencies a competitive edge, as they can do things that the big utilities have a hard time doing or can't do by virtue of their close relationship with the local government and the resources and tools available to local governments, opportunities for them to do special programs tailored to their local communities. Center for Climate Protection is involved in the California Energy Commission funded project on building efficiency optimization, working with a community choice agency on that project to use DER technologies to optimize, as this title implies, building efficiency, looking at 3 locations. And then also a National Renewable Energy Lab Solar Energy Innovation Network project on advanced rate structures for DERs. And just want to note that we do have our next webinar is going to be on March 21st at 11 a.m., focusing on how to keep the community in community choice energy. And so hope folks can join us for that. With that, I will now attempt to, this is not working here. I'm having some trouble. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I will now pull up Lorenzo's slides and go to full screen and switch over to Lorenzo sharing. Okay, here we go. Sorry, folks, a little bit of. Okay, Lorenzo, you should be able to take control of the screen now.
Okay. Are there buttons somewhere that I?
On your, you're in control of the PowerPoint now, so you should just be able to click through.
Okay, just with my arrow keys.
Yeah, should work.
Okay.
You want to just
well,
give it?
Let's go to. I will. Yeah, the arrow keys are not doing anything.
Yeah, that's the problem I'm having. My arrow keys are not working here for some reason. So let me just move your slides for you. Go ahead.
Okay, go back to the cover slide a minute first. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar, and really glad to be talking with you about these topics. Wanted to just give you a quick bit of information about myself. Many of you I probably know from my days at California ISO, where I worked for almost 19 years. I left there just a couple of months ago, but I am still working pretty much full time as in the space of energy system transformation and distributed resources and grid architecture and transmission distribution interface and most of the things I was working at the ISO. But in addition, I live in Davis, and I'm part of the Citizen Advisory Committee for Valley Clean Energy Alliance, which is the community choice aggregation enterprise of the city of Davis, the city of Woodland, and Yolo County, due to start up in beginning of June. So I'm engaged at the local level in the actual CCA that we're creating where I live, and then also involved in various policy endeavors at the state and national level. So today, go to the next slide, please, Woody. What I want to do is kind of set the stage here for how I'm thinking about communities and their roles and what's happening. Proliferation of DERs, as we're beginning to see, is challenging every aspect of traditional service, electric service. We have an industry that was designed for big central station power plants and one-way flows from the system down to customers at the other end. When I use DERs as an acronym, distributed energy resources, I mean anything that's connected to the distribution grid, in contrast to the ISO-controlled transmission system. So it includes all types of things: traditional energy efficiency, demand response, also DG, storage, EV charging, microgrids, and who knows what things may come along. But the crucial thing is, and they could be on both sides, either side of the customer meter. The crucial thing is that they are behaving in ways that affect the system at the distribution side rather than at the ISO side. And a major impact of that phenomenon is that this traditional structure based on centralized generation and one-way flows is now becoming obsolete. Another key characteristic is that a lot of the growth of DERs is autonomous and decentralized. That is, it's not policymakers deciding how to optimize the system and what things to put where. A lot of it is simply happening because the technologies are more powerful and customers want more flexibility and they want to try new things, or they have objectives like reducing their greenhouse gas footprint. Some of the local adoption is happening through community level decisions as well. So it's not something that's systematically planned at a large scale. In addition, electrification of transportation and buildings, this is really a crucial element of California's electricity and environmental policy, that in addition to the renewable portfolio standard saying that we want 50% renewable energy on the power grid, there's all these other things that are happening that are currently not part of the power grid. Transportation that uses fossil fuels, buildings that use fossil fuels, water pumping that uses fossil fuels. If California is going to achieve its greenhouse gas objectives, then electrification of these things is part of that story. And all of that is going to impact at the distribution system level. Transportation, electric transportation initiatives are going to be at the distribution system level. In addition, those things also are typically elements of local government planning. That is, the general plans that governments create regarding development that they are entertaining, regarding land use, regarding municipal services. All of that is going to be related to this electrification. So it's a question of, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, bringing in local government entities and their planning activities into this complex of achieving California's big goals, and it all plays out on the distribution level. And then the final point here is that resilience is becoming an important term more and more as major disastrous events take place and we become aware of the increasing volatility and severity of climate-related impacts, weather events that affect electric service, and through electric service affect people's lives, affect the provision of municipal services, et cetera. It became a big word in New York, certainly after Hurricane Sandy, but things continue to happen with more frequency and severity. Resilience, while we're there, while we're thinking about it, is still not very well defined, and I'll come back to that in a moment as well. Point for regulators is, how do we think about energy in a context where the decisions are being made at the bottom level, are coming up from communities and from individual customers? How can the regulators become facilitators rather than controllers of the transformation? Next slide, please.
Sure. And folks, I just wanted to mention a lot of these slides we have here today are information dense, and just to remind you that they are in your handout section. For folks that have just joined us, they're in the handouts. They will also be posted at the Clean Power Exchange website after the webinar. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Okay, so the context that we're operating in is raising unfamiliar demands. I already talked about the growing severity of disruptive events. I want to expand a little bit more on resilience right now, because when we think about long-term climate objectives, reducing greenhouse gases by a certain amount by 2040 or 2050, well, those are still decades away. And that mitigation of fossil fuel impacts is crucially important, but it's a gradual, longer-term process that most of those initiatives entail. Resilience, on the other hand, is really much more a near-term preparedness kind of thing. And even though we can talk about the resilience of the high-voltage power grid, I would say that all impacts of these disruptive events are local, because everywhere, even if something covers a large footprint like the hurricanes in Texas, for example, it's still people locally having to deal with the impacts. And so how do we strengthen at the community level the ability to be resilient, and what's the role in decentralized electric service and DERs in actually accomplishing that, so that when things happen, the crucial services that a local jurisdiction needs to provide can can be provided reliably and effectively. So it's the complement of those two things: resilience, near-term effects, mitigation for longer-term goals. All of these, though, still are at least partially within the realm of local government planning. So the bottom line here, local governments need to be key players in achieving California's goals with respect to resilience, energy, and decarbonization. Next one, please. So there's some new thinking that's needed in order to characterize DER benefits and quantify their value. This is one of the struggles right now, that when we think about DERs, there's a lot of discussion about, well, what is their value? Is it better to build locally or to build utility scale generation and all that? Part of the problem is that DERs often do not pencil out because we're using an outdated pencil. And by that, I mean that when we look at the benefits and costs of DERs relative to something else, we don't have good ways to count all the benefits that they're going to provide. And I think a lot of that is going to be local benefits rather than, say, transmission level benefits. Resilience is becoming increasingly important, but there really isn't a good functional definition of it, and even harder to figure out what its value is so that you can plug it into a cost-benefit assessment. In addition, the ability to avoid grid infrastructure, that if we simply have development of large amounts of distributed resources, then it's very easy to allow it to drive grid requirements for infrastructure and operational issues. The classic of this is the California duck curve that's been in the public view for quite a number of years, that happens at the system level at the ISO. That is, huge amount of solar in the middle of the day that can exceed the amount of demand on the grid, and then a real steep ramp up in the later afternoon. Well, one way to think about DERs is how can they be used at the local level to flatten that load profile, to eliminate the duck curve problem at the local level, rather than driving transmission infrastructure, rather than driving the use of gas peaker plants on the ISO system to manage steep ramps. If we can manage more of that locally, then there are greenhouse gas benefits as well as reduced infrastructure benefits. Again, these are things that we don't know yet how to quantify and put a value on, so that when we do cost-benefit assessment of things like local storage or microgrids or other types of DERs and see the benefits, that we get a more realistic cost-benefit assessment. And at the same time, because the DER developers are thinking, how do I make my project or my products more commercially viable, many of them are looking at wholesale market revenues. So they want to be able to participate in the wholesale market, sell and balance energy, sell ancillary services, which makes sense logically. But if you look at what's happening in the wholesale markets, the revenue sources, the wholesale market as a revenue source is shrinking. That became evident in the East over the last year or so, as there was more discussion about traditional plants not making enough spot market revenues to stay in business, and FERC opening up an inquiry, and some of the Eastern ISOs opening up an inquiry to think about how to pay them more. So going after wholesale market revenues may not be the silver bullet that makes DERs commercially viable. Similarly, the idea of stacking services, a very lovely idea that came out, I think it was initiated in a Rocky Mountain Institute report based on storage and looking at how you can stack services at different levels, also called MUA, or multi-use applications. That's really complicated. And the complication comes from the fact that if you have resources behind a customer meter, they're providing services to the customer, say, to manage demand charges, but they also want to provide services to the distribution grid, say, to manage voltage or to reduce congestion on a distribution circuit, and they may also want to sell into the wholesale market. Now, it's not a simple task to think about how do we measure what this thing is doing so that the different parties receiving services pay their fair share of what the costs are. How do we figure out what are the priorities if there are multiple needs to use this thing in a certain way and those needs come into conflict. There's a CPUC proceeding that's looking at that right now, but it's not simple to figure out how to do that. So these are just areas where we're looking for ways to value DERs in more conventional senses, but they may not have a big payoff and they may not be easy to solve. Go to the next one, please. So partnerships, local governments, utility distribution companies, that's our distribution utilities, and DER developers must be part of the new thinking. And I'm viewing that interrelationship among them is how all of this works. If you look at just their individual roles, the local governments are undertaking local energy and resilience projects to align with their residents' needs. Much of this being done through CCAs, but even governments that are not part of CCAs still have to think about resilience and still do planning exercises that are going to determine land use and building standards and that sort of thing, and local transportation. The UDCs, the utility distribution companies, primarily the IOUs, but also some of the munis, they have to prepare for a high DER future. If DERs are increasing, then the operational issues and the planning issues for their systems become more complicated. There are PUC proceedings dealing with this. But they play a role because the distribution system has to function in a high DER environment in order for all this to work. The DER developers, of course, they are trying to proliferate DERs to respond to customers' needs and desires, as well as community level needs and desires, and also to use DER capacity to provide grid services. So here's what the three of them are doing. Now think about opportunities for synergies. Looking, say, at the energy transportation nexus, the energy water nexus. How can at the city planning level, at the urban planning level, we find convergences between these, so that the energy decisions, when you develop, you want to change. For example, in Davis, we're doing a core downtown planning exercise where we're thinking about densifying in the core downtown area, having more residences. Well, what's that going to do to traffic congestion and parking congestion? How do we deal with that at the same time? Well, there's an opportunity now to think about a local transportation plan and then think about what would we electrify, how would we substitute private vehicles, and then how could the CCA play a role in terms of developing the local energy resources that are going to power that transportation alternative. Lots of other ideas are around here. Looking at local mobility services to reduce private car usage. Microgrid, and I'll talk about microgrids again in a minute, but the idea of creating little local subsystems of energy use that can actually function independently. If there's a major disruption on the grid, that local resource, that little local construct could operate as a separate entity. Municipal broadband, many cities are looking at that to provide not only internet service for all of the residents, but also to use for enhancing grid visibility, for water metering, and so on. Community level or multi-user microgrids and microgrid ready buildings. As we think about building standards, the idea of a microgrid tomorrow may be very expensive. But if new construction is being done, what can we wire into that new construction so that 5, 6, 7 years down the road, we could create a microgrid in a way that's cheaper than having to retrofit buildings with communications. Effective new rate structure. The old rate structures is problematic because charging based on a kilowatt hour usage to recover an asset value, we're finding is not working as you start adding lots more distribution connected resources. How do we think differently about creating rate structures? All of these bullets in this list are things where CCAs can be a vehicle for creating resilient local energy systems by thinking about their local community as a whole system and looking at the role of energy and electricity in that system. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to start with giving you, go ahead, next one. The next one just has a heading, and then as you advance, it'll add some pictures. So thinking about a big picture, where is the electric system going? And I'm starting with that big blue circle, which is a local distribution area. That is the area of distribution circuits at one interface point with the ISO grid or with the transmission system. It could be a community microgrid that's coordinated with the distribution utility. There's hundreds or maybe thousands of residences. There's dozens or maybe hundreds of businesses in that local area. Now hit one more advance. No, the other direction. There you go. Now inside this local area, there may be smart buildings. What I mean by this, a smart building is a building that could have solar panels, thermal storage, battery storage, vehicle charging, electronic control systems, etc. So that building essentially optimizes and manages its own energy use and has a single point of interconnection with the grid. The cool thing about it is that the grid operator may not need to care what's inside the building, may only need to deal with that interface. Hit one more advance. And now we add a microgrid. So think of say a university campus or a major medical complex or an industrial park. Individual smart buildings inside that microgrid, but then the microgrid is also another energy system that manages its own degree, its own energy usage, and could operate in a separation or island mode. Hit one more advance. Now we go to the connection to the balancing authority area. That's the ISO in California, which is responsible for system balancing. And each of those double arrows is now an interface point between distribution and transmission. And there are many of those big blue circles all around the system. And in California, there's a couple of thousand where they're local distribution areas. But all of that complexity that's inside the big blue circle can be reduced to a single interface point that the balancing authority area looks like. Hit one more advance. And this balancing authority is now in the Western Regional Interconnection, and there are 38 of these balancing authorities that make up the whole Western region. They all have interchange with each other. But the main point is now, if you hit one more, there's some bullets that come up down the right. When you see about how this system could work in the future, the storage, DG, controls, et cetera, on premises form a building level microgrid. That's what I call the smart building. And you can think about this in layers. Smart building is one layer. Microgrid is the next layer. Local distribution area is the next layer. Each layer only needs to manage its interchange with the next layer above and below, not see all the things internally, so that the balancing authority optimizes the bulk system, but it only needs to worry about the interfaces, not to manage a whole lot of things below that. This is a concept that comes from grid architecture or system architecture, the idea of a layered control structure. I'm showing you this because it's helpful sometimes to think about a future of where we're going with the industry as a whole at large because of the growth of DERs that we expect in the future. Where the CCA is in this is going to be in that local distribution area, because a community or a city may have a single interconnection with the grid and then want to operate that local area through some sort of a coordinated structure like microgrid. And what you get with this layered structure or fractal structure is very much the way nature creates complex organisms and ecosystems. Go to the next one, please. So a vision of the future really is a target to aim for. What might we want to see as a plausible, desirable future in, say, 2030? Resilient communities. How do we take on the idea of resilience at the local level to manage the risks of a more volatile future? Can we make that a California state policy goal? And there is material coming out from the State Resources Agency on that, a recent report talking about resilient communities. All California cities and counties have microgrids for essential services and for larger communities. That's very achievable. Most transportation is electric. Private vehicles dramatically decline. This, again, where we could be at 2030, that changes the energy usage pattern and the energy acquisition patterns. CCAs partner with utility DSOs, that's a buzzword for distribution system operators, some future evolution of the distribution utilities that operate resilient local networks that are linked to the bulk system so that you can move some renewable energy from different parts of the Western region and not be 100% dependent on local, but to a large degree dependent on local resources, but then also interrelating with the grid. Most uses of natural gas are eliminated. Cities use whole system thinking to integrate municipal services and look at synergies. Municipal broadband provides multiple services. All of these are potential areas where CCAs can interact with the other players, form partnerships, and really make a major impact on moving California forward. One more slide, and I think is the last one. Point of intervention for CCA. So here I'm posing some questions that when you think about the bigger policy arena that moves towards this future, what are some of the big issues at the policy level, state or even federal, where some changes need to take place to enable this industry transformation? How might high DER and microgrids redefine resource adequacy? Resource adequacy, that whole concept was built on peak system load and stacking up capacity resources to meet the system peak. Once we move into a high DER role, those needs change. Could a microgrid opt out of RA, for example, and island when grid supply is short? The idea of adequacy may be different if you say, well, we can separate from the system if there's a shortage supply. What's the value of resilience? What does it mean for a community or a local government? And how can CCAs foster and fund resilient projects? How to shape electrification-driven demand growth locally. We don't want to make the duck curve worse because that's going to drive a lot of unpleasant things that we don't want, like costly transmission investment or more use of fossil fuels from peaker plants. So how can we start shaping that through the right incentives so that we're creating flatter load profiles? What's the value of the distribution grid in the future and how is it paid for? How can we create incentives so that you're not just putting solar on your roof, but you're putting solar with storage, because the grid impact of that solar plus storage is really going to be a lot beneficial at the whole system level or at the community level. And design rate incentives so that we have well-shaped growth of renewables. And then finally, a new federal state jurisdiction accord at the TD interface. What might that look like if we were to have a layered structure? Could we have distribution level markets within these local distribution areas that are regulated by states rather than by FERC? Just different ways to think about the future. And for those of you interested in some of these policy issues at national level, FERC is having a technical conference April 10th and 11th on this subject, where they've got 2 days full of panels talking about a lot of these policy as well as operational questions. And I think that's my last one. Flip it to the one more, and I think, yep, that's the end. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lorenzo. That was an action-packed presentation. Very good. I'm sure that's generating lots of questions. So, Dave, as you take the helm, I would say, please, I'm going to try to give the control to you. Just try this again, see if it works for you. I just switched it over to you. You should have control. And I would just, and if you don't, I'll advance the slides, but I would just ask that you try to keep it, try to leave us 10 minutes, for some questions and answers, if you can. I know you got a lot to go through.
Absolutely. Let me see. Yeah, I am not
all right.
having any luck.
It's not working today, so I will advance for you. Do you want me to go to the first slide or the second?
Okay. No, just hang on here for a second. So just wanted to thank you, Woody, for seizing this opportunity to put these topics on, up in front of the group. I think it's very timely. I want to thank Lorenzo for that awesome presentation. Always thought-provoking, Lorenzo. Appreciate your perspective. So I just wanted to say that, just by way of intro, that I wrote this paper about a month ago, I guess, which was really more focusing on a comparison of some architectures for markets that were operating at the distribution level. There are three sort of like in common usage today. And my paper was more focused on looking at the requirements for grid modernization or high DER penetrations, which is primarily in the realm of the distribution operator. Because that is a potential source of pretty significant cost and could, the implementation of a market could, significantly change that cost depending on the market structure. So that's what the original paper was looking at. But then Woody posed this question: what do distribution markets have to do with CCA, and how can CCA potentially take advantage of them? So that got me thinking about, markets in CCA, and it really was good for me to go through this. So I have a lot of slides here that are kind of set up with context for markets and CCAs, and I'll try to go through those quickly. So if you want to go to the next slide.
Dave, before you continue, I don't know if there's anything that you can do about your audio, but you're kind of coming in sort of choppy and difficult to understand. So I don't know if there's anything that you can do to improve that.
Well, let me try changing position.
Well, right now you sound
this.
Right now you sound great. I don't know what you're doing, but right now you sound great.
Well, I stood up, so I'll have to imagine myself in professorial mode here from a lectern. Anyway, so this first slide, Lorenzo really spoke to this very well. We are in this context, as a society and nationally and globally, really, of moving towards a more decentralized and distributed architecture for our grid system. In addition, it also is more focused on renewables and low carbon. The decentralization process is in large part being driven by smart devices that are becoming more and more cost effective and more available. And so there is this sort of organic growth of distributed energy resources that is happening sort of irrespective of the sort of policy direction around it. So if you want to go to the next slide. So, again, Lorenzo touched on some of this, but there can be operational benefits of decentralization. Greater reliability being one of them. Of course, this implies a change in grid architecture as well, but that's a potential. The aspect of it I was looking at in my paper, which is the requirement for centralized computing power. As you decentralize and distribute intelligence, that puts a lot less strain on computing resources, and you can have a lot of dumb devices or relatively dumb devices doing very complex computing operations, a la distributed network, distributed intelligence networks. We see in very complex control applications today, like aircraft and things like that. So we have a lot of dumb devices, so that reduces the onus to provide high-powered computers. Also, we have this thing in the utility world called lumpiness. Resources can be right-sized that will enable sort of a less unused capacity. So there are other benefits. We have also the ability to much more localized forecasting. Forecasting is key, obviously, in energy management. You've got to have really accurate forecasts, and they can be done pretty accurately as well on a local level. So there are definitely operational benefits. And among those, again, very key one is smartness of these devices, inverters, both for batteries and PV systems, demand response, smart thermostats, all those kinds of grid edge devices are becoming very smart and can communicate, and they have functions, services they can provide to the distribution system. So all of those are benefits. So next slide, please, of just decentralization. Yeah, so there are also economic benefits, and this was kind of where the market conversation comes in. Markets are one way to be able to make sure that the prices are right and that owners of distributed energy resources can be compensated according to the value of their services that they're providing to the grid. So there are also the benefits to the community, I mentioned earlier. You can also do an economic dispatch of DERs potentially that can increase their operational efficiency. And then, finally, and there is this side benefit that we have, which is, this kind of is something that I've seen from my experience in high tech, is that as you increase the competitive landscape for different types of technologies, you really can push the envelope in terms of the speed of development and the evolution of these different types of technologies, and that is driven by economics as well. So next slide. So what are we talking about when we say decentralization of grid? And this is the context that was necessary here. Again, I'll try to move through this quickly. So next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of big picture, how it looks today. Everybody knows this picture. We're not in a world yet where there that isn't dominated by utility scale resources. Basically what the grid operator and the transmission owners, the power plant owners are providing to us is energy, and as well as the capacity to carry large amounts of energy and grid services, management of the grid to maintain power quality and reliability. And for that, we pay cost of service, which is the generation charge today and transmission and distribution charge. So that's the primary transaction, and CCAs are working within that. So the price of CCA pay the load serving entity for generation are set by the wholesale market or by bilateral contracts, and then the services of providing the distribution capacity are set by regulation. So next slide, please. So yeah, so this is kind of where CCAs come in. They are they were created originally, and this is based on long conversations with Paul Fenn, originated the CCA Concept back in the late 90s. That it was a response to regulation. So that was, of course, where generation, transmission, distribution were set up. The attempt was made to create a retail market for energy based on, wholesale, a wholesale market for power, and then load serving entities would procure the power. So and this was, the CCA concept came out of one of the failures of deregulation, which was basically that customers were reluctant or unable or unknowledgeable about being able to switch generators. So switching didn't occur at a large enough level, at a high enough level to create a competitive market per se. And so the CCA was created, municipal aggregation was created as a way to magnify the power of the group of consumers to get competitive electricity. electricity. So the CCA was designed to negotiate as a procurement or purchasing in a wholesale market. Next slide. So that leaves the distribution system basically in a very disjunct position with regard to the CCA. The CCA really doesn't have a lot to do with the sort of day-to-day operation or planning of the distribution system. The CCA is a procurement entity. Distribution operator really operates in a separate world. It's got its own planning process. It plans for capacity expansion. There's a guaranteed return on investment. It's a monopoly owner. It has complete operational control of the distribution system, and then the rates are set by regulation. The CCA doesn't have to do that. So
Hey,
next slide.
Dave,
This treat.
Dave,
Yes.
again, I don't know, but you know, you're fading again. So just, I don't know if there's something you can do to speak right into the mic or something. I don't know.
Okay. Do I sound okay now?
Right now you do, yes.
Okay. Can you go to the next slide? So yeah, this is just a summary of kind of what the distribution operator does. Again, you know, this is something we all know. Distribution operator is sort of a centralized operator. It has, you know, varying levels of instrumentation that go out to the system that and control capabilities enable it to provide the maintenance operations, respond to outages, guarantee power quality, and voltage primarily, and then it also, you know, operates the metering system and is sort of the gatekeeper for interconnection. The one thing that it doesn't really have a lot of visibility into right now is what you're doing behind the meter, and that can be either, you know, your load or the presence of distributed generation. They don't really have any visibility at all in that. They just need to respond. So that's kind of the world that we're in today. So next slide, please. So the distribution market conversation is, you know, at the moment today, it's all theoretical. We don't have any large scale DER market, and we look at net metering as the primary method for compensating folks that generate energy and put it onto the system at the distribution level. We don't really have any way to optimize DER for both location and operation. We don't have any concept of the prosumer, which is, you know, sort of the producer and the consumer in the same package behind the meter. And so, you know, we have DER markets at the wholesale level, as Lorenzo mentioned, but, you know, we don't have any way of doing a evaluation of DER services at the distribution level. And so, but DER can provide both energy and services at the distribution level. So next slide, please. Boy, I'm really running low on time here. Let's go up a couple of slides. I want to get to
up a slide, back.
Up a slide. Another one. Yeah. So this is where we look at market architectures. So you can get a more detailed look at what characterizes these different market models. But I think of them as you know, the analogies that exist today, which are the total DSO model, which is sort of equivalent to the New York Stock Exchange, the transactive energy model, which is sort of equivalent to your local farmers market, and then the blockchain model, which is more like your yard sale. So, you know, those are, you know, on a scale of decentralization. So next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of a busy diagram, but basically this describes the DSO and the DSO model or the total DSO. I want to just point out that the distribution operator still, controls things in the network. The distribution operator is to the right there. So there's a fair amount of um, grid infrastructure that has to be present for controlling and monitoring the performance of the DER. Right now, it's proposed that the internet be used for that, but there are security and performance issues with that. Um, so, the overall grid or the overall deal flow, if you go to the next slide, the overall deal flow is very similar to what happens at the CAISO in a large scale. You basically have devices that can be controlled or are variable depending on, it says, customer flexibility. So then you have a customer system that provides a flexibility curve to the grid operator. And then the grid operator runs a market that economically selects the different types of resources based on their price. And then it can, in this total DSO model, it would presumably broadcast those prices to the customers that would then allow the customer devices to make decisions about how to operate. So it's very centralized. It depends on a centralized operator in the grid market, much as the CAISO functions today. So next slide, please. And I'm really running out of time here. So anyway, the next two, I will just say that the key pieces here of the transactive energy is the ability for device level interaction. So device to device. So devices can negotiate a transaction and self-dispatch. So there's a device level negotiation and a self-dispatch. The distribution system operator is the party to all those transactions, and there's a centralized transaction database to settlement. So there's still some degree of centralization in this market model. So next slide. And then I'll try to wrap up really quickly. Next one. Next slide. Yeah. So the final one, and I'm just mentioning this here, the back one. I'll just mention this quickly. The blockchain model, this has really been more only seen in terms of microgrids. There's actually peer-to-peer, P2P means peer-to-peer, peer-to-peer transactions where one device can talk to another device. There is no centralized transaction ledger. So everything is completely decentralized, and the resources act as a swarm kind of, and this is still pretty speculative about how this. Next. So this was just some ideas about how CCAs could use distribution markets. So I think the other message is here that CCAs can get out in front of this, or they can, under blockchain, they can ignore distribution markets and they'll just happen, and there will be a decrease in consumption that the CCA would then have to manage. So, but the CCA can engage proactively as a platform provider. So next slide. Yeah, so this is just to show that right now CCA relationship with the distribution operator, and Lorenzo pointed this out, is ready for a partnership because distribution operator is going to be going ahead implementing grid modernization. They are going to be supporting the prosumer, and so distribution markets can be developed in partnership with the DER development, and it can really help to harmonize our operation with the distribution system operation. So that's what it's looking potentially. So next slide. This is the last one, I think. So there are some methods today, and I'd be happy to provide anyone links but the CCC has been conducting proceedings where there are maps available that show the ability to create projects that defer distribution system upgrade capacity upgrades, sorry. And the CCAs can get involved with this to specify locations and maps of DER that are optimal for a particular situation. So I think that's all I have. Is there another one? Yeah. So I'm sorry I kind of ran over a little bit there, but anyway.
That's okay, Dave.
That's it.
You know, it's it's a lot of stuff, and it's great stuff, and we appreciate it, both of you, Lorenzo and Dave, so much. And without any further ado, what I'd like to do is invite invite Nina to read any questions that have come in. And I want to say before we kick into that, I know we're not going to get. I imagine we're not going to get to all the questions. So, folks. This system does record. We save. We have all of the questions that have been entered in, so we can follow up after the webinar. We are going to end on time, so we can follow up after the webinar with your questions. And feel free to email me if you really want to get your question answered. Okay, go ahead, Nina.
Okay, so there's a few. Some of them you can both speak on. The first one being, how can DERs best be advanced within already existing CCAs where formal structures and goals have not made DER an integrated build-out feature?
Lorenzo?
Well, I think that CCAs probably, some of them do this already, but I think it's important to think about what are the community's goals for the CCA? What do they want to try to accomplish? And I think stating goals will often lead to DERs as the solution to achieving those goals. The one that comes to mind most immediately is resilience. How can we improve resilience at the local government level or at the community level? And a lot of that will be creating DER-based local power structures and facilities that can continue to operate when there are disruptive events. So I think it comes back to the CCA in conjunction with the community members and in conjunction with the local government, figuring out what are the really high priority goals. And then you'll find that DERs are good solutions to achieve those goals.
Yeah, I would just add that I think part of the problem too has been that CCAs are constrained somewhat by the net metering tariff as a way of incentivizing behind the meter resources, and there's no way to really do it strategically. So there are planning processes that need to be conducted that involve strategic planning of DER deployment and how you incentivize that or how you source it.
All right. Well, I think we have actually only time for about one more question, probably. So go ahead, Nina.
Okay, so the last question I see here, for energy generators interested in entering the CCA energy space to sell electricity, what is the current process of becoming a registered seller, and what do you see as future changes to that process to make it easier for green energy to reach CCA customers?
Well, I think right now, you know, the green energy provider is basically treated as a merchant generator by the CCA, and the CCA negotiates a bilateral contract, which is then, you know, sort of administered through the CAISO process. There is another opportunity for CCAs that I think all the CCAs now have what they call a feed-in tariff, where the bilateral contract does not have to go through the CCA, but it's CAISO, but in the FERC process, but it's all done for systems that are under 1 megawatt, I believe. so there's a couple of different venues. Those are all sort of detailed on with the CCA websites. I think you can find out about how, as a conventional sort of provider, wholesale provider, you can negotiate a contract with the CCA.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Dave. Lorenzo, any final words from you?
Well, the only thing I would add is that the CCAs are all very different, and I think it's important for the potential developer of resources to get to know them. You know, go in and get acquainted with the directors or the procurement people. Every CCA has the responsibility to procure sufficient energy to meet the needs of their customers. Now, that said, most of them start with procuring energy from existing resources or existing suppliers, but most of them are also thinking in the future that they want to develop local resources. So as someone who's a provider of energy, which camp do you fall into? Do you have existing resources and you want to just sell them energy? Or do you want to form a partnership and actually develop a local resource? And I think the answer for how that could happen is going to be different in the different CCAs. So I think, you know, it comes down to beginning to make those personal contacts.
Right on. I agree totally. Yes, the key thing is to engage with the Community Choice Agency. They are all public agencies, and folks, anybody, all stakeholders in the community can attend those public decision-making meetings. So that's a key, essential answer there. So thanks very much, both Lorenzo and Dave. Fantastic presentations. Just a couple of upcoming dates and things for folks to remember. We have our next webinar on March 21st, also at 11 a.m. Now, we had some requests to keep it off the lunch hour, so starting at 11, keeping community and community choice. Our presenters will be announced. On April 13th, is the next Lean Energy CCA market call. They are skipping March, so don't look for that in March. They'll be back on April 13th. We have our Business of Local Energy Symposium coming up in Sacramento on June 5th. Hope folks can attend that. And again, anybody that wants to follow up with any questions or anything, that's my contact information. And ending a little bit over time today, but thank you all very much for attending, and we look forward to having you at future webinars. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.